The morning sun was just beginning to peek through the tall office buildings of downtown, casting long shadows across the busy streets. Maya walked this route every day, her laptop bag slung over her shoulder, joining the river of people rushing to start their workday. But unlike the others, she noticed things, little details that most people missed in their hurry to reach their destinations. For the past 3 months, she had seen the same elderly woman sitting on the concrete planter outside the glass-fronted Morgan building. The woman's silver hair was always neatly combed despite her circumstances, and she wore layers of worn but clean clothing. She had a quiet dignity about her, never begging, never making eye contact, just sitting there with an old paperback book in her lap. Maya worked as a software developer at a growing tech company, and at 24, she was already making her mark in the industry. Her parents had always taught her to work hard and be aware of her blessings, lessons that echoed in her mind each time she passed the elderly woman. That morning was different, though. Maybe it was the way the woman's hands trembled as she turned the pages of her book, or perhaps it was how she had tucked herself tighter into her thin jacket against the autumn chill. Maya found herself slowing down, her usual brisk pace becoming hesitant. The woman must have felt Maya's gaze because she looked up, revealing eyes the color of a winter sky. There was something in those eyes, not desperation or pleading, but a deep wariness that spoke of a life that had taken unexpected turns. Around them, the city was waking up. The coffee shop across the street was filling with its morning crowd, business people checking their phones while waiting for their lats. A street cleaner rumbled past, and somewhere nearby, a car horn humped impatiently. Maya checked her watch. She was early for work, as usual. She had developed the habit of leaving her apartment with plenty of time to spare, knowing how unpredictable city traffic could be. Her team meeting wasn't until 9:30, and her desk was just a few minutes away. The woman had returned to her book, but Maya could see her shoulders hunched against the morning breeze. October had brought an early chill this year, and the thin jacket the woman wore couldn't be providing much warmth. As Maya stood there, memories of her grandmother flooded back. How she used to say that everybody has a story worth hearing, you just have to be willing to listen. Her grandmother had been gone for 5 years now, but her wisdom still guided Maya through life's moments of uncertainty. The morning crowd continued to flow around them like a stream around rocks, everyone focused on their own destinations and deadlines. A young man in a business suit nearly bumped into Maya, muttering an apology without looking up from his phone. The incident seemed to highlight the disconnect between the bustling life of the city and the quiet solitude of the woman on the planter. Maya felt something shift inside her at that moment. It wasn't pity. There was nothing pitiful about this woman who maintained her dignity despite her circumstances. It was recognition, perhaps, of the thin line between security and uncertainty, or maybe it was simply the realization that in this big, busy city, people could be incredibly alone together. The woman turned another page in her book, and Maya caught a glimpse of the title. It was a well-worn copy of Pride and Prejudice. The sight of this classical romance in the hands of someone who had so little struck Maya as both poignant and powerful. Here was someone who held onto literature, onto stories, even when life had stripped away so much else. Standing there, Maya made a decision that would change not only her morning routine, but the course of both their lives. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest choices, and as Maya took her first step toward the woman, she had no idea that she was starting a chain of events that would challenge perceptions, touch hearts, and eventually capture the attention of an entire community. The city continued its morning dance around them, delivery trucks backing into alleys, shopkeepers unlocking their doors, office lights flickering on floor by floor in the surrounding buildings. But for Maya, everything had slowed down to this moment, this decision, this first step toward connection in a world that too often celebrated disconnection. The morning had a bite to it that hadn't been there the day before. Maya could see her breath forming little clouds in the air as she walked, purposefully this time, toward the coffee shop. Inside, the warmth and the smell of fresh coffee wrapped around her like a familiar blanket. The barista, a young man with kind eyes, was already reaching for 2 cups before Maya could speak. 2 hot chocolates today, he asked, noticing her glancing repeatedly toward the door. Maya nodded, grateful for his understanding without needing an explanation. While she waited, she watched through the storefront window as the elderly woman pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders, the book still balanced carefully in her lap. The hot chocolate was perfect, not too sweet, with a dollop of whipped cream on top. Maya carried the cups carefully, her heart beating a little faster with each step. It was strange, she thought, how something as simple as approaching someone could feel so momentous. "Excuse me," Maya said softly, stopping a respectful distance from the woman. "I thought you might like something warm to drink." The woman looked up, surprise flickering across her face before settling into cautious curiosity. Her eyes, Maya noticed, were a pale blue that reminded her of winter mornings. That's very kind of you," the woman said, her voice soft but clear, with traces of what might have been a southern accent. Her hands, when she reached for the cup, were thin but steady. "I'm Rose," she added after taking a careful sip. Maya introduced herself, gesturing to the empty space on the planter. "May I sit for a few minutes?" When Rose nodded, Maya settled beside her, leaving enough space to be comfortable but close enough to talk easily. "Pride and Prejudice," Maya noted, nodding toward the book. "That's one of my favorites too." Rose's face lit up, the years seeming to fall away as she smiled. "I've read it so many times I've lost count," Rose admitted, running her hand gently over the one cover. "Mr. Darcy reminds me of my Thomas, proud on the outside, but with such a good heart." Her voice caught slightly on the name, and Maya noticed how she touched the simple gold band she still wore. The next 15 minutes passed like water flowing downstream, natural and unhurried. Rose had been a high school English teacher for 30 years, she explained, in a small town about 3 hours away. Her eyes sparkled as she talked about her former students, about the joy of introducing young minds to literature. "But life has a way of throwing curveballs," Rose said, her smile fading slightly. "Thomas got sick, cancer, and even with insurance, the bills." She trailed off, but Maya understood. It was a story she'd heard before, of how quickly security could crumble, of how the system that was supposed to protect people could sometimes fail them instead. Around them, the city continued its morning routine. People rushed past, phones to their ears, coffee cups in hand. A delivery truck beeped as it backed into an alley. The sun had climbed higher, warming the air slightly, but Maya could still feel the underlying chill of the season changing. "What's your favorite part?" Maya asked, steering the conversation back to safer ground, nodding toward the book. Rose's face brightened again as she began to talk about Elizabeth Bennet's strength of character, about how the story showed that first impressions aren't always right. Maya checked her phone. She still had time before her meeting, but she needed to go soon. Something made her hesitate, though. There was so much more she wanted to know, so many questions about how someone goes from teaching literature to sitting on a concrete planter with all their possessions in a weathered backpack. "I have to get to work," Maya said finally, standing up reluctantly. "But would it be okay if I brought hot chocolate again tomorrow? Maybe we could talk more about books." The hope in Rose's eyes made Maya's heart squeeze. "I'd like that very much," Rose replied, her fingers curled around the now empty cup as if holding on to the warmth. "It's been a long time since I've had someone to talk to about books, about anything really." As Maya walked the remaining distance to her office building, she felt different somehow. The city seemed both larger and smaller at the same time, larger in its possibilities, smaller in the connections that could be made between two people over something as simple as hot chocolate and a shared love of literature. Her phone buzzed with work emails and meeting reminders, pulling her back to her regular world of deadlines and code reviews. But part of her mind stayed with Rose, wondering about her story, about the paths that led her to that planter, about the strength it must take to maintain dignity and grace in the face of such adversity. Maya realized that in trying to offer kindness, she had received something valuable in return. A reminder that behind every face in the crowd, behind every person we pass without seeing, there's a story waiting to be heard, a connection waiting to be made. As she swiped her keycard to enter the building, she was already looking forward to tomorrow's conversation. The next few weeks fell into a comfortable rhythm. Each morning, Maya would arrive with 2 hot chocolates and a brown paper bag containing breakfast, sometimes muffins, sometimes bagels, whatever the coffee shop had fresh that day. She started arriving 30 minutes earlier than usual, carving out time for these morning conversations that had become the highlight of her day. Rose never asked for anything, but her eyes would light up when Maya appeared. They talked about everything and nothing: classic literature, Rose's teaching days, Maya's struggles with her latest coding project. Sometimes they just sat in comfortable silence, watching the city wake up around them. One particularly chilly morning, Maya noticed Rose's hands trembling more than usual as she held her cup. "The shelter was full last night," Rose explained quietly, seeing Maya's concerned look. "But I found a good spot behind the library. The security guard there is kind. He pretends not to see me." Maya's heart clenched. She'd been helping Rose navigate the complicated maze of social services, spending her lunch breaks researching housing assistance programs and making phone calls. The waiting lists were long, the requirements complex, and the system seemed designed to exhaust people before they could get help. "I brought some forms from the housing office," Maya said, pulling papers from her bag. "And I made copies of your old ID like they asked for." She'd been keeping a folder of Rose's documents safe at her apartment, helping to rebuild the paper trail that homelessness had scattered. Rose's eyes welled up as she looked at the carefully organized papers. "You remind me so much of my Jenny," she whispered, touching a worn photo she kept in her book. The picture showed a younger Rose with a teenage girl, both smiling at the camera. "She would have been about your age now." Maya waited, sensing there was more to the story. Rose rarely mentioned her daughter, and Maya had been careful not to push. Sometimes silence was the best way to make space for difficult truths. "Car accident," Rose continued after a moment, her voice barely audible above the morning traffic. 6 years ago. Thomas was already sick then. Sometimes I think losing her took the fight out of him. He stopped responding to the treatments after that." The morning crowd flowed around them, oblivious to the weight of the moment they were witnessing. A street sweeper rumbled past, and somewhere nearby, construction workers began their day with the rhythmic sound of hammering. "I made an appointment for you at the benefits office," Maya said gently, giving Rose time to compose herself. "And I can go with you if you want. I took Friday morning off work." She didn't mention that she'd been saving her vacation days for this, knowing how overwhelming government offices could be. Rose's hand found Maya's, squeezing it briefly. "Why are you doing all this?" she asked, not for the first time. "You have your own life, your own problems to worry about." Maya thought about her grandmother again, about the lessons of kindness that had shaped her childhood. "Because everyone deserves someone in their corner," she said simply. "And because you've become my friend." Their morning meetings had started drawing attention. Maya noticed the curious glances from other regulars on their morning commute. The coffee shop barista now had their order ready without being asked, and sometimes he would add an extra pastry to the bag with a wink. But not all the attention was positive. Maya had overheard whispers, seen the suspicious looks from some passers-by. One morning, a security guard from the building had approached, asking Rose to move along, until Maya firmly explained that Rose was her guest. "We're making progress," Maya said, reviewing the paperwork they'd submitted. "The housing coordinator said your application looks strong." She didn't mention the hours she'd spent on the phone advocating for Rose, or the strongly worded emails she'd sent to various agencies. Rose nodded, but Maya could see the wariness in her face. The nights were getting colder, and despite her careful budgeting of her small social security checks, Rose couldn't afford even the cheapest room. The shelters were overcrowded, especially as winter approached. As Maya gathered her things to head into work, she made a decision. She'd been thinking about it for days, turning it over in her mind, weighing the risks and responsibilities. Her apartment had a spare room. It was small, barely more than a closet really, but it was warm and safe. "Rose," she said, turning back, "I have an idea I want to talk to you about tomorrow. Something that might help, at least temporarily." The hope that flickered across Rose's face strengthened Maya's resolve. Walking into her office building, Maya felt the weight of her decision, but also a sense of rightness. Her coworkers greeted her with their usual morning nods, unaware that just outside, a former English teacher was rereading Pride and Prejudice for the 100th time, waiting for someone to see her story as worth hearing. Maya sat at her desk, opened her laptop, and began researching tenant rights and housing regulations. She would do this properly, protect both herself and Rose. Because sometimes, she realized, the biggest acts of kindness weren't grand gestures, but simple offers of shelter from the storm. The weather forecast on Maya's phone showed an angry red storm system moving toward the city. The meteorologist's words echoed in her mind. Severe weather warning, potential flooding, temperatures dropping below freezing. She glanced out her office window at the darkening sky, her heart heavy with worry about Rose. That morning, their usual hot chocolate meeting had been briefer than normal. The wind had picked up, making it difficult to hold onto their papers, and Rose had seemed more tired than usual. Maya had noticed her coughing, a deep, worrying sound that spoke of too many nights in the cold. During her lunch break, Maya couldn't focus on eating. Instead, she paced her small office, phone in hand, calling every shelter in the city. The responses were all the same. We're at capacity. There's a waiting list. Try back tomorrow. The storm was driving everyone inside, filling every available space. Maya looked around her spare room one more time. She'd spent the previous evening cleaning it thoroughly, making space in the closet, putting fresh sheets on the small bed that had rarely been used since her college friend had stayed over last summer. The room wasn't big, but it had a window that looked out over the city, and most importantly, it was warm and dry. At exactly 4:30 p.m., Maya shut down her computer and grabbed her umbrella. The first fat drops of rain were already falling as she hurried out of the building. The wind had picked up even more, turning umbrellas inside out and sending trash skittering across the streets. She found Rose in her usual spot, trying to protect her precious book with a thin plastic bag. The older woman's silver hair was already damp, and her hands shook as she tried to gather her few possessions. "Rose," Maya called out, holding her umbrella over both of them. "Please come with me. I have a spare room. It's not much, but it's yours for as long as you need it." The words tumbled out faster than she planned, driven by urgency as the storm gathered strength. Rose looked up, her blue eyes wide with surprise and something else. Fear? Pride? "I couldn't possibly," she began, but her words were cut off by another bout of coughing. "Just until the storm passes," Maya pressed gently. "Please. I can't bear the thought of you out here tonight." Thunder rumbled in the distance, emphasizing her point. Rose clutched her book tighter, and Maya could see the internal struggle playing across her face. "I don't want to be a burden," she whispered, barely audible over the sound of passing traffic and strengthening wind. "You're not a burden," Maya said firmly. "You're my friend, and friends help each other." She held out her hand, remembering how her grandmother used to say that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is accept help when it's offered. A particularly strong gust of wind swept down the street, sending a cascade of water from a nearby awning. Rose's thin jacket was already soaked through. She looked at Maya's offered hand, then at the threatening sky, and finally back at Maya's face. Just until the storm passes, Rose agreed quietly, reaching for Maya's hand. Her fingers were ice cold. Together, they gathered Rose's belongings, the backpack containing her spare clothes, a small photo album, and a few treasured books. Maya insisted on carrying the heavier bag, while Rose clutched her copy of Pride and Prejudice close to her chest. The walk to Maya's apartment took 15 minutes, though it felt longer as they battled against the strengthening storm. Maya kept glancing at Rose, worried about her breathing, which seemed more labored with each block. "It's not much," Maya said as she unlocked her apartment door, suddenly nervous about what Rose would think. The space was small but tidy, with houseplants on every windowsill and books stacked on almost every surface. Rose stood just inside the doorway, dripping onto the welcome mat, looking almost afraid to move further into the warm space. Maya gently took her wet jacket, hanging it on a hook by the door. "Let me show you where everything is," Maya said, leading the way. "Bathroom's here. There are clean towels under the sink. And this?" She opened the door to the spare room. "This is your space." Rose's eyes filled with tears as she took in the small but clean room, the made bed, the reading lamp on the bedside table. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "Say you'll take a hot shower and change into dry clothes," Maya replied with a gentle smile. "I'll make us some soup for dinner." She pulled out a pair of warm pajamas she'd bought the day before, tags still attached, and set them on the bed. As Rose disappeared into the bathroom, Maya heard the first real drops of the storm hitting her windows. The weather alert on her phone warned of severe conditions lasting through the night. She moved around her kitchen, warming soup and making tea, listening to the sound of the shower running and feeling, for the first time that day, like she could truly breathe. Later, as they sat at Maya's small kitchen table with bowls of hot soup between them, Rose seemed to relax slightly. color had returned to her cheeks, and the terrible cough seemed less frequent. "Just until the storm passes," Rose repeated softly, as if reminding herself. But they both knew the forecast called for 3 days of severe weather, and the temperature wouldn't rise above freezing for at least a week. Maya nodded, not pushing, understanding that pride and independence were sometimes the only things people had left to hold on to. "Just until the storm passes," she agreed, even as she made mental notes to stock up on groceries and to make sure the spare room heater was working properly. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside Maya's apartment, 2 souls found shelter, one from the physical storm, the other from the quiet storm of wondering if she was doing enough to make a difference in the world. The storm lasted longer than expected, bringing 3 days of relentless rain and wind that rattled windows and flooded streets. During this time, Rose slowly settled into a routine in Maya's apartment, though she still spoke often about not wanting to impose and finding other arrangements soon. Maya's apartment building sat in a quiet suburban area, where most residents had lived for years and noticed everything. The first signs of trouble came in small ways: curious glances when Maya and Rose would enter or leave together, whispered conversations that stopped when they passed by, and the occasional neighbor who would clutch their purse tighter in the elevator. Mrs. Chen from apartment 4B was the first to directly approach Maya one morning as she collected her mail. "That older lady staying with you," she began, trying to sound casual, "is she family?" The way she emphasized the last word made it clear she already knew the answer. "She's a friend," Maya replied simply, sorting through her letters. She could feel Mrs. Chen's eyes on her, evaluating, judging. "A friend," Mrs. Chen repeated slowly. "Well, dear, you should be careful about bringing strangers into the building. You never know these days." She patted Maya's arm in what was probably meant to be a motherly gesture, but felt more like condescension. The whispers grew louder. Maya overheard snippets of conversations in the lobby. "Did you see her? Living with some homeless person. Should we be concerned about security? What if she brings more of them?" One evening, Maya returned from work to find Rose sitting quietly in the spare room, her book unopened in her lap. Something was wrong. Maya could feel it immediately. "Mrs. Patterson from next door came by earlier," Rose said softly. "She said she was checking if I needed help, if I was being kept here against my will." Her voice cracked slightly on the last words. Maya felt her heart sink and anger rise simultaneously. Mrs. Patterson was the self-appointed president of the building's resident committee, known for her concerns about building security and her tendency to call the management office over the smallest issues. She kept asking if I was okay, if I needed her to call someone. Rose continued, her hands twisting in her lap. "I told her I was fine, that you were helping me, but she just kept looking at me like she couldn't believe I was telling the truth." Maya sat down beside Rose, careful to give her space. "I'm so sorry," she said. "Some people just can't understand kindness without looking for ulterior motives." That weekend, Maya noticed more changes. The usually friendly security guard began asking to see her ID every time she entered the building, despite having known her for 2 years. Parents in the elevator would pull their children closer when she and Rose got on. The cleaning staff started checking her floor more frequently, citing security concerns. It came to a head at the monthly resident committee meeting, which Maya usually skipped but decided to attend after hearing it mentioned in whispered conversations. The community room was more crowded than usual, and the conversation stopped abruptly when she walked in. Mrs. Patterson stood at the front, discussing recent security concerns and the importance of knowing our neighbors. Her eyes kept drifting to Maya as she spoke about maintaining the building's standards and protecting our community. Maya stood up, her heart pounding but her voice steady. "If anyone has concerns about me or my guest, they can talk to me directly," she said. The room fell silent. "Rose is staying with me because she needed help, and helping others shouldn't be seen as suspicious." "We're just concerned about safety," someone called from the back. "You don't know anything about her background." "I know she was a high school English teacher for 30 years, Maya replied. "I know she lost her husband to cancer and her daughter in a car accident. I know she quotes Jane Austen and drinks her hot chocolate with extra whipped cream. I know her better than I know most of the people in this room." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken prejudices and assumptions. Maya could see some people shifting uncomfortably in their seats, while others stared at their phones or the floor. Later that evening, Maya found a note slipped under her door. The handwriting was shaky but determined. Incident report. Suspicious activity involving elderly woman possibly being held against her will. Police welfare check requested. Maya's hands trembled as she read the note. She'd heard about welfare checks being used as weapons before, about how concerned neighbors could turn simple acts of kindness into something sinister through their own biases and fears. In the spare room, Rose was reading peacefully, unaware of the storm gathering around them. Maya watched her for a moment, seeing not a threat to building security, but a woman who had lost everything except her dignity and her love of books. The sound of distant sirens made Maya's heart race, though she told herself they could be heading anywhere in the city. But deep down, she knew the neighborhood watch had made their move, and tomorrow would bring challenges neither she nor Rose were truly prepared for. She didn't sleep much that night, listening to the normal sounds of her apartment, the hum of the heater, the occasional creak of floorboards, the soft sound of Rose turning pages in the next room. Each noise felt precious somehow, like the calm before a storm, like moments to be remembered before everything changed. The knock came just as Maya was setting the table for dinner. 3 sharp raps that seemed to echo through the apartment. Rose looked up from where she was stirring the pot of vegetable soup they'd made together, her face paling slightly at the sound. "Police department," a voice called through the door. "We're here for a welfare check." Maya took a deep breath, squeezing Rose's hand reassuringly before walking to the door. She opened it to find 2 officers, one older with graying hair at his temples, the other younger with kind eyes that reminded her of her brother. "Good evening, officers," Maya said, keeping her voice steady. "How can I help you?" The older officer consulted his notepad. "We received a report about a possible," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "situation involving an elderly resident. Mind if we come in and take a look around?" Maya stepped back, opening the door wider. The smell of homemade soup filled the apartment, and classical music played softly from the small radio in the kitchen. Rose stood by the stove, her silver hair neatly combed, wearing the comfortable sweater Maya had bought her last week. "I'm Officer Rodriguez," the older officer said, "and this is Officer Chen." They looked around the apartment, taking in the bookshelves lining the walls, the potted plants on the windowsills, the 2-place settings on the small dining table. "We're just about to have dinner," Maya explained. "Would you like to join us? There's plenty of soup." The office seemed to catch the officers off guard, their practiced professional expressions slipping for a moment. Rose stepped forward, her chin held high despite the slight tremor in her hands. "I'm Rose Wilson," she said. "I was a high school English teacher for 30 years in Springfield. I'm staying here because Maya offered me shelter during the storm, and," her voice wavered slightly, "because she's shown me more kindness than I've known in a very long time." Officer Chen moved toward the kitchen, looking at the photographs Maya had helped Rose put up on the refrigerator, old pictures of her teaching days, of her daughter Jenny, of Thomas. "These your family?" he asked gently. "Yes," Rose replied, walking over to stand beside him. "That's my late husband Thomas and our daughter Jenny." Her voice grew stronger as she talked about them, sharing the story of Thomas's battle with cancer, of Jenny's tragic accident, of how life can sometimes take unexpected turns. Officer Rodriguez was making notes, but his posture had relaxed. "Mind if I see where you're staying, ma'am?" he asked Rose. "Of course," she replied, leading him to the spare room. Maya watched as Rose proudly showed him her neatly made bed, the small bookshelf Maya had helped her arrange, the reading lamp positioned just right for evening reading. "And you're here of your own free will?" Officer Rodriguez asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Very much so," Rose said firmly. "Maya saved my life in more ways than one." She looked at Maya with such genuine affection that Maya felt tears pricking at her eyes. Back in the living room, Officer Chen was examining the housing assistance paperwork spread out on the coffee table. "You're helping her navigate the system?" he asked Maya. "Trying to," Maya replied. "It's complicated, but we're making progress." The officers exchanged a look that seemed to contain an entire conversation. Officer Rodriguez cleared his throat. "Well, everything appears to be in order here. Clearly, someone misunderstood the situation. Would you really like to stay for soup?" Maya offered again. Rose makes it special, her mother's recipe from Louisiana. The officers declined politely, but something had shifted in their demeanor. You know, Officer Chen said, pausing at the door, my grandmother used to say that angels don't always have wings, sometimes they just have open doors and kind hearts. After they left, Maya and Rose sat down to their dinner, the soup still warm on the stove. I was so scared, Rose admitted, her hands finally showing their full tremor. I thought. I know, Maya said softly. But we're okay, we're more than okay. They ate in comfortable silence for a while, the classical music still playing softly in the background. Outside, the city lights were coming on, creating a warm glow through the windows. Maya, Rose said suddenly, thank you. Not just for the room, or the help with paperwork, but for standing up for me. For seeing me as a person, not a problem. Maya reached across the table and squeezed Rose's hand. You know what my grandmother used to say? She said that family isn't always about blood. Sometimes it's about who shows up when you need them most. Later that evening, as they cleaned up the kitchen together, they could hear Mrs. Patterson's voice in the hallway, probably telling another neighbor about the police visit. But somehow, it didn't seem as threatening anymore. The truth had stood up to scrutiny, and kindness had won out over suspicion. Maya glanced at Rose, who was humming along with the radio as she dried dishes, and felt a profound sense of rightness. Sometimes the family you choose, she realized, is even more precious than the one you're born into. And sometimes the biggest acts of courage aren't grand gestures, but simply opening your door when others would close theirs. Spring arrived early that year, bringing with it changes that no one in the apartment building could have predicted. The story of Maya and Rose had spread through the neighborhood, not as a scandal as some had hoped, but as something entirely different, a tale of friendship that challenged people's assumptions. Mrs. Chen from 4B was the first to change her tune. One morning, she knocked on Maya's door with a homemade curry and an awkward but sincere apology. My own grandmother came to this country with nothing, she admitted, her eyes downcast. Someone helped her too. I forgot that for a while. The transformation in the building happened slowly, like ice melting in the spring sun. The security guard started greeting Rose by name, often asking her opinion about the books he was reading. Children in the elevator no longer shied away, but instead were drawn to her gentle smile and her stories about her teaching days. Even Mrs. Patterson, the resident committee president who had called the police, underwent a change of heart. It happened the day she found Rose helping her grandson with his English homework in the building's common room. The boy, who had been struggling with Shakespeare, was now excitedly discussing Romeo and Juliet with the former teacher. He's never been so interested in reading before, Mrs. Patterson confessed to Maya in the mailroom. Rhodes has a way of making the stories come alive. The words seemed to cost her something, but they were genuine. The housing assistance paperwork, which had been moving at a glacial pace, suddenly found itself expedited. It turned out that Officer Chen's sister worked in the housing department, and after his visit, things began moving more quickly. Within 2 months, Rose had qualified for a small apartment in a senior living community just 3 blocks away. The day Rose moved into her new place was bittersweet. Maya helped her arrange her few belongings, the books, the photos, the small treasures that told the story of her life. The apartment was tiny but bright, with a window that looked out over a small community garden. I can't believe this is really happening, Rose whispered, touching the keys like they might disappear. A few months ago, I thought. Her voice trailed off, but Maya understood. A few months ago, Rose had been invisible to most people, just another face in the crowd that others hurried past. But the story didn't end there. Rose might have moved out of Maya's spare room, but she didn't move out of her life. Their morning hot chocolate tradition continued, now at a small cafe halfway between their homes. Rose started volunteering at the local library, running a reading program for children that quickly became the most popular weekend activity. The local newspaper picked up their story, not focusing on the controversy, but on the friendship that had blossomed between them. The article sparked conversations throughout the city about homelessness, about prejudice, about the simple power of seeing people as people. Other buildings in the neighborhood began working with local shelters to create temporary housing programs. The resident committee, led surprisingly by Mrs. Patterson herself, started an initiative to help seniors navigate housing assistance paperwork. The ripples of one simple act of kindness spread wider than anyone could have imagined. One evening, about 6 months after everything began, Maya and Rose sat in Rose's small apartment, sharing tea and cookies. Rose's walls were now covered with children's drawings from her library program, and a small potted plant from Maya's collection sat on the windowsill. "You know what I think about sometimes?" Rose said, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. "That morning when you first brought me hot chocolate, you could have walked past like everyone else. What made you stop?" Maya thought about it, stirring her tea slowly. "I saw you reading Pride and Prejudice," she said finally. "And I remembered something my grandmother used to say, that books are like bridges between people. They help us see each other's hearts." Rose smiled, touching the worn copy of the book that still sat on her bedside table. "Your grandmother was a wise woman. She would have liked you," Maya said softly. "She always said that family isn't about who you're born to, but who you choose to love." As if to prove the point, their weekly dinner tradition had expanded. Now it included Mrs. Chen's curry, Officer Chen and his family occasionally joining them, and even Mrs. Patterson dropping by with her grandson for book discussions. The small apartment had become a gathering place for an unlikely family, bound together not by blood but by choice. The next morning, as Maya walked to work, she passed the spot where she had first seen Rose sitting. A young woman was there now, setting up a small table with a sign that read "Free books. Take one, leave one." The idea had been Rose's, a way to share her love of literature with others who might need it. Maya smiled, thinking about how a single moment of kindness could grow into something so much bigger than herself. As she walked on, she heard Rose's voice in her head, quoting her favorite line from Pride and Prejudice. "I have been used to consider poetry as the food of love." But in their case, it wasn't poetry that had fed love. It was simply the courage to see beyond appearances, to reach out when others turned away, and to believe that every person's story deserves to be heard.